Let us think a little bit tonight about the subject of prayer. Prayer is a means of contact with God. Through prayer, we come into communion with God. Through prayer, we become aware of God's will for us. Through prayer, we learn of God's way with us, of God's purpose for us, of God's plan. Through prayer, we find what our way is to be, what our function on earth is to be, what our work is to consist of. Through prayer, we receive guidance, direction. Through prayer, we find all of the necessary support for our activity, for our lives, for our work, for whatever function we are to perform. Through prayer, we receive God's grace. And God's grace always appears in our experience in the form necessary at the moment. God's grace opened a way for the Hebrews to escape from the Egyptians. God's grace appeared as manna when they needed food. God's grace appeared as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night when these were needed for their protection. God's grace appeared as a raven bringing food to Elijah, as a poor widow sharing. God's grace always went before Jesus to prepare the way for him, to supply food in the wilderness for the multitudes, to supply healing and raising from the dead. God's grace appeared as forgiveness of sin. God's grace lifted him from a tomb. God's grace went before the disciples. On many occasions saw that they were fed, protected. But all of this is accomplished through prayer. God's grace isn't visible or evident to what the Master called this world, the world that he overcame, the world of humans. God's grace is not caring for those tens of millions about whom you read in India and China, who even in this modern day are starving. dying of, diseases that could easily be cured. And the reason is that God's grace reaches human experience through prayer. But unfortunately, not the prayer that people are taught to pray. There is a prayer beyond that which is ordinarily known, which has always been known to the mystics of the world. Centuries upon centuries before the Master, and in all of the centuries since the Master, righteous prayer has been known to the mystics of the world, but not to the people of the world. In the experience of every individual on the spiritual path, the most important subject they will ever meet is that of prayer. Probably, we might say, the most important subject is God, whom to know aright is life eternal. But there you have it. You can't know God aright except through prayer. You can't read about God, for no one who has ever lived in the history of the world, not even the Master, who had the capacity of telling you what God is, how God is to be served, how God is to be known. Every mystic knows God. Every mystic can commune with God. Every mystic may receive God's grace. But none has ever been able to tell another what God is or how God may be contacted. In the Western world, the Occidental world, the only approach, direct approach to God, has been that which was taught by the mystics of the 12th to the 17th centuries in Europe. And it was the way of meditation, such as the Quakers brought to the United States. But this, of course, was based on the Oriental teaching of communion, which in its turn was based on the ability to meditate. There is more to meditation than just closing the eyes. There is more to meditation than just thinking thoughts. And that is why meditation of itself is difficult. But meditation is a form of prayer, and it is a way in which we can reach God in communion. Now, in the Western literature, there are no writings on the subject of meditation comparable to those that we have in the Infinite Way. Be assured, if there were, I would tell you about them. But even this literature will not enable you to successfully meditate unless you put into it the necessary degree of devotion, consecration. And the reason is this, that anything that can be given to you intellectually can only be in the nature of that which will show you the way, because you have to take it from that intellectual knowledge and transform it into spiritual demonstration. In other words, meditation is a spiritual activity, and therefore the only help you can receive from a message on meditation is the preparation, how to prepare for the experience, how to get ready for it, how to start on it. I'm thinking of Einstein when he said that the true mathematics, the higher mathematics, only begins where you leave off the intellectual process and jump off into the intuitive. This is more so in the subject of prayer and meditation. All that has been written in the San Francisco lecture series, in the art of meditation, in practicing the presence, all that has been written on meditation can only lead you to the kingdom of God within yourself, but it cannot make you enter the kingdom. That you have to do by carrying meditation and prayer a point beyond the intellectual, into the intuitive or spiritual. It is this way with the entire subject of prayer. As you know from our entire message, prayer is not a going to God for something, nor is it an attempt to enlighten God as to our needs or to influence God in our behalf. Prayer actually is meant to produce a state of receptivity in which we become aware of God speaking to us or leading us or guiding us or protecting us or feeding us or supplying us or healing us. Therefore, all that can be written in the message of the infinite way on the subject of both prayer and meditation can lead you to the kingdom within yourself and can bring you to the place where you are ready and willing to give up talking to God, directing God, asking God, expecting something of God, trying to influence God, bribe God, to where you are willing to give these up and adopt the attitude of, "Speak, Lord, thy servant heareth." A servant doesn't tell the master what he wants. A servant doesn't tell the master when he wants it. A servant doesn't expect the master to do his bidding. A servant places himself in subjection to the master, at the disposal of the master's will, in the master's service, and then becomes obedient in carrying out the directions, the guidance, the wisdom given him. Of course, the master always feeds and clothes and houses the servant, so the servant need take no thought for his life, what he shall eat or what he shall drink or wherewithal he shall be clothed. The servant has only to be obedient to the instructions given by the master. And this is our attitude toward God, that we are servants of the Most High, and that it is not our function to tell God or ask God or try to influence God, but rather our attitude is to be, Thou art the Father, I am the Son. Thy will be done in me and through me. Thy grace shall be my sufficiency, so that I need take no thought for my life. I need take no thought for what I shall drink or eat, wherewithal I shall be clothed or housed. I can safely leave this with God, my master. And give my entire attention to listening for the still small voice, to listening for the voice of God. And when he uttereth his voice, the earth melteth. When he uttereth his voice and I hear it, a pathway is made before me. The crooked way is made straight. The barren way is made abundant. The desert is made fruitful. When the Spirit of the Lord goes before me. The Spirit of the Lord can only go before me as I make myself a transparency. As I bring myself to a listening consciousness, a state of listening receptivity, an eagerness to be taught by the Father within, an eagerness to be led, directed, protected, maintained, sustained. Prayer is that attitude of being in which we find ourselves when we have acknowledged God as the principle of our life, the essence and the law unto our being, a light unto our feet, wisdom unto our mind, strength unto our body. And then in quietness and in confidence, keep one ear open all of the time for that inner guidance, that inner wisdom, that inner leading. Prayer is always an attitude of receptivity. Prayer is always an inner state of humility. It is an attitude of thy will be done, thy grace be performed, thy light to shine, thy strength to be experienced. It is almost as if we were to say, I can of my own self do nothing or be nothing. Father, thou art my all. And then always live with that open ear, that state of receptivity, that willingness to hear the still small voice. Acknowledge him in all thy ways. There is no other way to pray the prayer of a righteous man. There is no other way to pray than to make oneself a stillness, a quietness, a peacefulness, and a listening ear. Prayer that contains words and thoughts meant for God is not really prayer at all. Prayer is opening out a way for God's power to be made manifest in and through us. Prayer is an inner cleansing, an inner purification, which results in erasing the word I. I want, I would like, I shall do, I am, I would be, I can. True prayer has neither words nor thoughts, because it has no desires except one, to know thy will, to know thee aright, to be a fitting instrument. Otherwise, prayer is a desireless state of being. It is one in which this inner stillness waits for God's will to be known, God's will to be shown, God's will to be made evident. It is an inner stillness that waits for God's thoughts, for God's thoughts are not your thoughts. God's ways are not your ways. Therefore, be still with your thoughts and be still with your ways. And let us hear God's thoughts, and let us come to know by listening God's ways. Thou wilt lead him in perfect peace. Thou wilt lead him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. There is a formula. Thou wilt lead him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on thee. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. What must I do? Acknowledge that the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not fear. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not fear. He feedeth me in the wilderness. He setteth a table before me in the wilderness. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Therefore, my function is not to tell the all-knowing mind, but rather to listen to the all-knowing mind. Listen and be still. Be still and know that I am God, and therefore I need take no thought for my life. It is prayer to acknowledge that God is omnipotent. God is omnipotence, omniscience, all wisdom, all knowledge, omnipresence, the only presence, the only power, the only law, and the only life. It is prayer to acknowledge this and then be still. Be still that that omnipotence may establish itself in your consciousness. Be still that that omniscience, that all wisdom, may impart itself to you. Be still that omnipresence may reveal its presence to you. For only in stillness can you become aware of God's grace functioning in your experience. Only in stillness, in quietness, in confidence, can you become aware of the presence of God appearing as manna, appearing as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, appearing as food for the multitude in the wilderness, appearing as resurrection, appearing as ascension. You can only become aware of the presence of God in quietness, in stillness, in confidence, in assurance. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And in that assurance, in that inner peace, the presence of God reveals itself. For this is the secret. You do not need God to come to you. You do not need to make contact with God. For already I and the Father are one. Already the place whereon thou standest is holy ground. But it is necessary to be still in order to become aware of the presence that is already present where you are. Even though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you need fear no evil. For the presence of God has gone before you. Where thou art, I am. Where God is, I am. All that the Father hath is mine, and I can become consciously aware of it in demonstration. But in only one way: in quietness and confidence, in stillness, in peacefulness, in an inner assurance that the place whereon I stand is holy ground because God is already there. God does not have to be brought to you by prayer. Prayer does not bring God to you. Prayer does not bring God's grace to you. Prayer reveals God where you are. Prayer reveals God's grace active where you are. Even though you make your bed in hell, Prayer will reveal that God is there. Whether Joseph was in a pit, whether he was sold into slavery, or whether he was in prison, God's presence was with him and went before him, or else he never would have mounted up to be the second in command of Egypt. We, in our human experience, are stumbling through life. We're not walking through life, nor running through life. We are not going through life divinely guided, led, and protected. We are stumbling because we know not where to walk. We do not even know how to pray or what to pray for. We are the blind leading the blind as humans, and it is only when we learn to stop talking to God, asking God, pleading with God, demanding of God, only when we stop this and settle into an inner assurance that after that we walk the mystic way. Every step God governed. Every step God led, God protected, God supplied, God maintained. Every step we find that He performeth that which is given me to do. At every step we find that His wisdom is infinite. His power is available. We are divested of the word I. Not I am spiritual, not I have spiritual power, not I have God, but divest oneself of the word I and realize His power, His wisdom is infinite. His grace is with me. His voice maketh the earth to melt. The heavens declare His glory. The earth showeth forth His handiwork. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, and thou wilt keep him in perfect peace, whose mind is stayed on Thee, recognizing God's grace, God's power, God's wisdom, God's love for God's own creation. In this assurance, it is very simple to be quiet inside, to be still, to listen for the still small voice, and this leads us to the experience of meditation in which a conscious contact is realized. One becomes consciously aware of God's presence, as much so as if God could be seen, felt, or heard. Sometimes in this God contact, there is a mighty perfume, a mighty aroma of perfume, and sometimes a most wonderful music. And none of this perfume is known to the nose, and none of this music is heard by the ear, but the soul feels it within, in the stillness of a perfect meditation. When thought is still, and thought can only become still when it is desireless. As long as one has a desire, thought cannot be still, because thought must always attempt to attain that which it desires. Only in pure desirelessness can thought be still, for then there is nothing to be attained, nothing to be achieved, nothing wanted. There is only that stillness which the psalmist knew when he said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," and then he could rest. He could rest in that assurance. There was nothing for him to want because the Lord is my shepherd. The government is upon his shoulder. The support, the supply, the protection, the sustenance, God's grace, all of this is on God's shoulder. And our contact with it is through our recognition of this truth, which results in a desirelessness, which in turn results in a complete absence of thought. You will find that thought is only active in desire, in wanting something, seeking something, trying to attain something. When there is nothing left to attain, when there is nothing left to desire, when one has the assurance that since the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, you find how easy it is to slip down into a thoughtlessness, a state of being without thought, and yet not asleep, not dead, not unconscious, but wide awake and alert in that listening attitude. God is closer to me than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. Watch the effect upon yourself. If you take 5 or 10 minutes for this form of prayer and start with a realization, in this prayer I want nothing, I'm not seeking for anything, I have no desires, nothing to attain, nothing to accomplish. This is a prayer in which I will be still, rejoice, be glad. For God is, and that is enough for me to know. God's grace is my sufficiency, and that's enough for me to know. The Lord is my shepherd, so I need not fear for anything or take thought for anything. And so I can sit here now in quietness, in peace, and let God speak to me. And as you do this, you'll find how simple it is to be still. Watch the magical effect upon your life when you learn to go to God not less than 3 times a day without a desire, without a wish for any demonstration of any kind, merely for the joy of inner communion, just for the idea of being still in God's presence. I'm sure all of you have been in a church or a temple, a cathedral, and felt the sacredness of the edifice or the sacredness of the presence within the edifice, or perhaps met a minister or priest and felt the sanctity of their consciousness and wanted nothing more than to sit for a minute or 2 or 3 in the presence of that minister or priest, or, if there were none there, just in the atmosphere of holiness that permeated the temple or church or cathedral. That is exactly the right attitude for prayer. The desire to be in God's presence and be still and be silent and be wholly without desire, just for the joy of being in that sacred presence, in that holy atmosphere. What more could one wish? To know thee aright. Prayer of this nature is an immediate contact with God, an immediate entrance into the soul of God, the heart of God, the Spirit of God. Prayer of this nature is a holy experience. It always results in a touch of grace. Often it results in a promise coming right to the ear. I am with thee, or I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, or I will be with thee unto the end of the world, or fear not, it is I. Fear not, it is I, or thou art my beloved, in whom I am well pleased. Always this type of prayer results in an immediate experience with God. Once you perceive that the function of prayer is to bring to you an awareness of God's will, of God's pleasure, of God's wisdom, you will immediately unlearn all that you formerly knew about prayer. Understand that the function of prayer is to bring to you an enlightenment from God. It is not to bring to God some message from you. And when you perceive this and begin to reverse the old concepts of prayer, so that you never think of prayer in terms of telling God, influencing God, then you will find that prayer becomes one of the greatest delights that can be known on earth. It is no wonder that Paul could say, pray without ceasing. I don't know why he had to say it, except that he must have been talking to people who did not know how to pray. For if one learns how to pray, no one will ever have to tell them to pray without ceasing. It would be a punishment to have to stop praying. For prayer is the ability to receive from God. It is a state of awareness, a state of inner peace and joy, inner communion. When we think in terms of getting something or being rewarded for our prayers or being benefited, we lose the benefit of prayer. We dare not even think of human friendship with the idea of what we are going to get out of it. Much less dare we think of God in any sense of what we are going to get because of our God contact. For all we want is God itself, and nothing beyond that. All else lies within the jurisdiction of God. How we shall be fed and when, how we shall be clothed and with what our work shall be, what our reward or remuneration or recompense will be, all of this lies in the hand of God, as long as we don't desire it. Our only desire is to know Thee aright, to commune with Thee, to become aware of Thy presence, a presence that already fills me, a power that already permeates me, a being that is already within me. How am I to become aware of this if I'm busy thinking, wanting, desiring? Be still. Be still. I am God. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. It is my good pleasure to give thee the kingdom. Take no thought. Take no thought. Live always in the remembrance that you are in the presence of God, and you will find that you are. Live always in the remembrance that God's grace is your sufficiency, and you'll find that it is. Live always in the remembrance that God is walking with you every step of your life, from waking in the morning to sleeping at night, and standing beside you all night through. Live in the remembrance of this truth, and you will find that it is the truth. Live always in the conscious awareness of the presence of God going before you, and you'll find that it does. Live always in the remembrance that God is your bread, wine, your water, and your meat. And you will find that you are always fed, clothed, housed, as befits the child of God. Live always in the remembrance that God knoweth your need before you do. And you will find that it is true. Live always in the remembrance that it is God's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And you'll find that it is. Live always in the assurance of God's grace, and you will find God's grace to be your sufficiency. Do not expect God to give you things or persons or conditions, for God gives only himself, and himself appears as all forms necessary to our experience. Do not think of God as giving supply, but rather understand that God is the bread, the meat, the wine, the water. Do not think of God sending a law of healing, for God himself is the law of grace, the law of healing, the law of comfort, the law of resurrection, and the law of ascension. Never think in terms of God and, for there is no God and something else. God is infinite, and therefore God constitutes all else. Thank you. Thank you.